oftentimes while conducting research, we have to make decisions on the fly. And so this is one example of where those decisions can be detrimental. There's certainly situations where decisions during research can be very beneficial. But today we're going to look at different perspectives, and you guys can weigh in on what you think. Things are often not as simple as they may seem while we're learning in the classroom and trying to discern what some of these decisions and conclusions might be. So with that, we will jump right into the study. So I want to give you a quick background about the drug itself that was under investigation. It is a combination product. So there were two drugs that were previously approved, naltrexone, hydrochloric acid, and bupropion. So naltrexone was approved for opioid addiction and alcohol dependence, and bupropion was approved for depression, seasonal affective disorder, and smoking cessation. There were, of course, known potential side effects with these products. Naltrexone was associated slightly with some seizure-related illness, and bupropion with suicidality and neuropsychiatric effects. So there were existing surveillance for these very specific types of side effects. This was a joint submission to FDA by two companies, Orexigen and Takeda. So in their submission, their initial submission, they had proposed a REMS program. So REMS is a risk evaluation mitigation system for that particular product. And so they had proposed one for the two side effects that were already known for each of the individual products. And they recognized rather, that they may actually have to commit to doing that once the product was approved. That being said, FDA raised some concern about the cardiovascular outcomes associated with this product. So initially, FDA had stated that a REMS may not be needed at the time of that initial submission. However, after going through all of the studies that had been conducted, all of the data that had been submitted, there was a dispute about whether or not they would need to potentially complete a cardiovascular outcome trial. They came to an agreement after much negotiation that FDA was going to assess some interim data for this cardiovascular outcome trial before the approval of the resubmission. So they had already agreed that they needed to resubmit for the approval of this product. This time, however, FDA said that a REMS study would likely not be needed. So they kind of got out of that particular hurdle that they would have to clear. They did, however, stipulate that it would not be certain until they had actually seen all of the data that were submitted for this particular drug. So I want to pose a question to you all before we delve too far into the details of the studies. So before we get into them, putting on your regulator hat, how would you utilize the interim results for a cardiovascular outcome trial in the review process? Mind you, this is not the full data. It would only be a partial conclusion, so to speak, for the cardiovascular safety of two already approved products that are now being used in combination. How hard would you push for this trial to be conducted? Would you push for the trial to be conducted given the existing safety data on the two component products? Any thoughts or opinions? And again, no right or wrong answer. We really are here just to discuss and get your perspectives. Anyone? I hear someone off.
Sheriza? Oh,
Yes, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm kind of confused, and maybe I wasn't listening carefully, but they wanted the REMS for suicidality, but the trial was going to be done on cardiovascular outcomes?
Correct. So the REMS that they had proposed were on side effects that were already known. And so after looking at the data, and we'll get into some of the context as well, they wanted to add a potential REMS for the cardiovascular outcomes. But even prior to that, they wanted the cardiovascular outcome trial to ensure that this drug that was going to be used by patients with obesity would not increase their risk of MACE. right, how about we jump right into some of the details and the context so you guys can understand a little bit about why that might be. So in order to understand the context a little bit more, we need to understand the politics surrounding it as well. And so this figure here represents a little bit of some of the drivers for decision-making in terms of regulatory priorities, as well as funding decisions during that time. Again, we are not anti-pharma in this group. We do need drugs. This is one of the reasons why many of us are here, learning how to conduct meaningful and useful drug trials. I know this particular figure does not paint industry in a very positive light, but it is pretty representative of how things are run. So during this time, drug companies were lobbying Congress for faster and more approvals, while simultaneously promoting diet drugs to medical associations. So there was more lobbying to Congress by provider groups as well. And so they were advocating for obesity to be seen as a chronic condition. During this time, that was not necessarily a given. Now, I think we can all recognize that obesity is in fact a chronic condition that should be treated, that drugs should be developed for. One of the prominent names doing that at that time was Dr. Neeson, who was also the primary author on the trial that we're focusing on today. By mandate, Congress pushed FDA for more approvals for this very specific indication. So as you can see, this may seem counterintuitive, but it is very representative of how many funding decisions around both primary research and regulatory initiatives are made. It's this continuous feedback loop. So we're in a situation where FDA is being pressured to actually approve these drugs, get them to market faster, review them faster, of course. And so one way to deal with that pressure is actually to have these cardiovascular outcome trials that could potentially get to a result faster than us waiting until the full 100% of the anticipated events are actually occurred. In addition to that context, we also have some big regulatory events that fed into how both FDA and the sponsor dealt with the situation. And so the first of these was the risk evaluation mitigation strategy that was set up for all new antidepressants. And we'll get into some of the cases that led to that. So all new antidepressants that came on the market were required to have a REM system in place in order to assess any potential increase in suicidality or neuropsychiatric events. In addition to this, we were also dealing with cardiovascular safety for diabetic products and the potential for there to be an increased risk within that particular patient group. And as we all know, patients with diabetes and patients with obesity often overlap. And finally, the other big hurdle that both the company and FDA had to grapple with was the recall, of course, of weight loss drugs. And so I want to pose another question to you all. To what extent might each of these influence how you review the submitted data for the new product, knowing that it's intended to treat obesity, a condition that affects a very large, very diverse swath of the population? We'll circle back to this question, but I want you to think about that as we move through the next couple of slides. So the first context for this is the drug recall for anti-obesity drugs. Are any of you aware or familiar with the fen-phen case? I know some of you may have been super, super young. Okay, so as you can see from this news clipping from 1997, fen-phen was pulled from the market, primarily because of the QT prolongation issues with it. And so fen-phen, again, is another combination product. Both of the drugs that were used to compose it were on the market, excuse me, for many, many years. The novelty, however, was using them in combination with other weight loss drugs. And so this particular combination was never actually approved by FDA. Two studies showed that they were effective together and they were promoted as such. So again, FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. If the drugs are out there, they can be used. There was a significant increase, however, when you were using both of these drugs in serotonin, and that in turn damaged the blood vessels and the heart valves. So that was the mechanism of action for that particular concern. These heart valve defects then were showing up on EKGs. So generally speaking, the patients were very asymptomatic. However, we were seeing a very large increase in QT prolongation. So we have a situation where we have a generally well-tolerated drug that was used in combinations that were thought to be safe and effective in a population with obesity based on non-regulatory studies. This, of course, then led to serious conditions, including 3 deaths. So this is somewhat related to our situation at hand in that the patient population is very similar, and we're looking at a combination of very old drugs. This led to many, many news articles regarding the pulling of fen-phen off the market. As you can imagine, it was very catastrophic. There are very few pills at the time, or medicines rather, that could treat obesity. And so removing this was certainly a huge hit to that particular treatment regimen. In addition to this, many patients were actually very traumatized by this. They finally had a drug that worked for them or that they thought would be very successful in helping them overcome their obesity. And then it was pulled from the market. So there were many implications to consider in terms of the consequences of post-marketing data potentially showing that a particular drug could be harmful. So with that, I do want to pose a question. How heavily might you, as a reviewer, potentially weigh these data when you're looking at clinical data submitted for a new product for patients with obesity? Given this historical context, how might you incorporate that? Any thoughts? Yeah.
So the drugs that's
I believe it was a combination that was consequential and had to be pulled.
so
If anyone else knows, please chime in too.
so the individual drug can still be used. So it's just not.
I think the fenfluramine was pulled. All products with fenfluramine were pulled. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
To answer your questions, Sheriza, I can imagine for the reviewers at the time, there would be a lot of pressure to really set a high bar for cardiovascular safety. After this type of event, I know, the FDA is kind of regulating things in real time. It's real cases and things like that. And so I would say if this was something coming to me, I would really want a high bar in terms of cardiovascular safety for similar drugs, especially since, today in 2024, we do have the lens of many safe drugs for obesity, but I know at that time that wasn't the case.
Absolutely. There was certainly a fallout after fen-phen was pulled. And the hesitation to bring certain types of drugs to market was certainly felt. Any other thoughts on the review process? Would you care that, an old drug was pulled from the market for a safety issue that, quite frankly, does not have much of a relation to the drug that you're actually reviewing? Is there any way you would use that information? Is there any way that it's relevant? Just some things to think about. And so the next contextual detail that we'd like to discuss today is the cardiovascular safety of diabetes drugs. And so this also had a bit of a fallout in terms of regulatory decision-making and how things were actually reviewed. So in 2007, there was a black box warning for Avandia, rosiglitazone, for those of you who are more familiar with diabetes drugs. This black box warning was placed for an increased risk of MI associated with rosiglitazone. Because of this, however, it caused FDA to take a look at all diabetic drugs and all of the trials that were done for those products in order to assess whether or not there was an increased risk for cardiovascular events. In light of this, they issued a guidance in 2008 requiring large cardiovascular outcome trials for any new diabetes treatment that was going to hit the market. This also meant looking back at some of the data that was analyzed in order to assess that this was a problem. And this led to a rescinding of that black box a few years later. However, the quote unquote damage had been done, depending on how you want to contextualize it. And many of these products that were already on the market were subjected to the cardiovascular outcome trials, as well as any new products that came as well. So what you see here in the green circles on the left, those are all of the significant, rather, of all the events that were related to a particular class of drug, the TZDs, that kind of spurred this whole issue. And after 2013, we see a huge increase in the number of trials that are looking at cardiovascular safety of diabetics products. As you can see, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but it is a huge amount of resources, a huge amount of trials, a huge amount of participants who are involved in studying the cardiovascular safety of every single diabetic drug that has been approved since. That being said, posing another question to you all of these drugs have various mechanisms of action. It is unclear as to what the mechanism of action was to spur the increase in cardiovascular events with certain products. There could be potentially different levels even of severity among these patients. Given all of these details, are we comparing apples and oranges? Are diabetic drug safety and obesity drug safety correlated? Are there things about these patient populations that you might want to consider during a review of an obesity drug? Are there things that may or may not be relevant? Any thoughts? You guys are quiet today. I know it's midterm season.
Well, this might be just stating what we already said, but the fact that obesity and diabetes can be so intrinsic, they're so related, but also it would be a mistake to consider them the same thing and the same. While some drugs might work for both indications, it can't be necessarily assumed. And so when thinking about the strict, as Dr. Hammett mentioned, with this high bar for cardiovascular implications, it would be important to consider both populations. And even though there is crossover, understanding how it works in each disease separately would also be key.
Absolutely. And when I look at this particular figure, one thing you guys should know, these drugs were not pulled from the market for cardiovascular risk. And in fact, many of them are quite safe with regards to cardiovascular outcomes. So the question then becomes, are we putting, there's an ethical question, right? So are we putting participants, patients at further risk by engaging in these trials and not bringing the products to market faster? Are we being overcautious? I think as trialists, that's something we do need to keep in mind. Are we, quote unquote, doing too many trials, so to speak? I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer, and I don't know if we'll come to a conclusion, because there seems to be more and more regulations in this vein, quite frankly. Any other opinions?
Well, Sheriza, what do you think is the role of pharmacoepidemiology in
That comes into play with cardiovascular outcomes specifically. With pharmacoepi data, it's been very difficult to actually identify the outcomes that we're interested in. So it becomes a little trickier. And in terms of assessing adherence, especially with diabetic drugs, it becomes very, very sticky. So it's a little bit harder to determine. So I understand why, if you're looking at this very specific question, a trial is going to be the best option. But I agree, we can leverage, given that we know that many of these classes are safe, we can leverage existing real world data in order to answer them. So yes, excellent point. I think we had one comment in the room.
Similar thing, like time. Data. Is it,
I think this is one of the cases that actually pushed FDA closer to actually acknowledging it and using it to help in decision-making, not necessarily to make the decision. We're getting there, but not quite fully there.
so then another. Would FDA rather take more cautious and approve a drug slower and make sure that it's safe, or release it and like put a black box warning or get it off market? And it's like, I don't know, it's more of a public reputation.
That's exactly what it is.
It's okay.
That's exactly what it is. And that's exactly why we're looking at this case within the context of a research in progress and not a journal club. I want you guys to think about that, because when you graduate here, many of you may go into regulatory, many of you may go into industry. These are the issues you're going to have to grapple with. You know the data. We know you know the data. That's why you're in this program. But translating those data into the context that we talked about today, as well as the context that you are going to encounter in your own companies, in your own agencies, that's where the struggle comes, right? And so advocating for the data too is going to be important. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. And the final contextual bit in order to frame this whole issue, of course, is the REMS for antidepressant drugs. For those of you who were around and cognizant of regulatory affairs at that time, antidepressant drugs had a very strong impact on suicidality for children. This was a very tragic case. I personally lost a friend to this, and many of you may or may not have known people who unfortunately suffered from this particular drug event. Paroxetine was the first drug that was identified as being problematic in this regard in 2003. After that, FDA had an advisory committee meeting in 2004, and they realized that there was a potential increase of risk for suicidality in children, about 1.95 increased risk, in fact. Because of that, a black box was added to these products, and additional studies were conducted in adults. On top of that, FDA decided to conduct an internal analysis on the data that they had received from drug companies over the years for each of these products. They're in a unique situation where they actually had access to these data. As you can imagine, academic researchers, even individual companies, could not collectively gather data for all of these various products, and do this type of research. After doing their own independent analysis, they decided that, in fact, it was quite concerning that antidepressant products were associated with an increased risk in patients under the age of 25. As such, they set up the required REMS system for any new products and existing products within this antidepressant sphere. Any questions or so on the context before we jump into the study? Okay. So this story is more than just the trial, but we'll start with the trial. And so for those of you who are interested in some of the things surrounding the trial, this particular write-up for the investigation has a huge discussion section that I highly recommend skimming through. It talks about some of the decision points that they actually had to go through as investigators as well. And so the general trial design was basically the investigational product versus a placebo. They had planned to accrue about 8,900 participants, which they did actually do, short a couple here and there. They had the FDA mandated placebo-controlled non-inferiority trial for time to first MACE. And so that planned interim analysis was planned after 25% of the events had accrued. And they wanted to rule out the 95% upper limit for that hazard ratio of 2.0. So they wanted to see that it wasn't greater than 2 times risk. They also had planned a superiority test after 50% and 75% of those events had accrued. And again, they wanted to rule out within a 99.7% confidence interval for the the 50% analysis, an upper limit of 1.4, and within a 95.6% confidence interval for the 75% accrual of 1.4. For the two superiority tests, however, they did have a correction for alpha spending. They did not have that for the 25% interim analysis. So keep that in mind. FDA had agreed to make a decision at the 50% event analysis with post-marketing commitment to complete the trial, of course. This allowed for the quicker market launch, which was in the best interest of the patient advocacy groups, as well as what Congress was pushing for this particular class of drug. And it also allowed for some level of reassurance on the efficacy and the plan for the confirmation. After that initial non-inferiority analysis, rather, they realized that there was a benefit, that the risk was reduced, and they were able to rule out that 2.0 hazard ratio. It was, however, intended that only that core statistical team and the regulatory team would see it, as well as FDA, and all parties had agreed to confidentiality. However, it turned out that about over 100 people actually saw the results of that interim analysis. So that was incredibly unexpected, certainly on the part of FDA, but also on the part of the general patient community, because now this was out in the open. And we'll talk a little bit about how that played out. Before we do, though, I wanted to point out one study that looked at non-inferiority margins. And again, hindsight is 2020, but this particular study showed that recalculating that non-inferiority margin based on the observed number of events versus the anticipated number of events led to a difference in conclusion about 1 in 4 studies. So just keep that in mind, because this is a situation where we did not hit the event number that we were anticipating at that 25% mark, just given on how it was defined. So there was certainly room for a different interpretation of the results. So where did things fall apart? We love timelines, so we're going to start here. In November of 2013, that's when we had the 25% event interim analysis. And this is what the results look like. So this is straight from the DSMB. And this was what was submitted for a patent application a month after. Knowledge of any type of unblinded interim comparisons from a clinical trial is generally not necessary for those conducting or sponsoring the trial. And so the concern there is that that knowledge can lead to some level of bias. As I mentioned before, over 100 people saw the results for this particular interim analysis, not to mention all the people who might be patent geeks and also read the patent applications. The outcome of the study was inappropriately shared, as you can see. And so continuing it kind of came into jeopardy. Do we continue once we now know where we are in terms of that interim analysis? How do we continue in terms of the interim analysis? Generally, we don't want this to be accessible to anyone other than that DSMB, the statistician perhaps, and of course the regulators. That being said, in December 2013, they had the filing, and then January 2014, the academic researchers decided to terminate the recruitment for that particular study. So this came as a huge shock to everyone involved. And this is where I'd like to get your opinion as well. It was a very pragmatic rationale for stopping the trial. The interim results were released, yes. What's the cat out of the bag? The argument here was that it would be impossible to recruit. Do we buy that? Is that a decision that could be supported from a regulator's point of view, from a provider's point of view? I mean, this is a study that was intended to show that there might be a reduction in cardiovascular events with this product in a very high-risk population. And they were ending it early, and it was a requirement that they not end the trial. So any thoughts?
think it's something that like when the benefits, it's like clearly,
Mhm.
yeah. So it's the same thing that is happening with the select trial right now, like
Mhm.
about the GLP-1 agonists and
Mhm.
other stuff. That they ended the trial before because of the like the benefits and outweighed it like the other all the expectations. So there's
Absolutely.
no need like to wait for all the trial to be in for that.
How much is enough? 25%?
Uh,
Yeah, so this is at 25%. They thought that, okay, we have enough information, right? By the time they finished, as you'll see, they actually had reached closer to 50%. That being said, though, is it enough? Yes, no, who knows? But we don't have the statistical backing to actually make a conclusion here, right? Because that comparison that they were making was not control for multiplicity of testing, anything like that, right? So they did not conserve their alpha spending at all for that one analysis, and they were making the decision. So that, to me, as a regulator, would be cause for concern. I'm not sure how you guys might feel about that. Or is the difference so large that it actually doesn't matter, right? That was the argument. That the difference we were seeing, it could not be overcome even if we continue recruiting. So in January, of course, recruitment terminated. By September, we had the 50% event interim analysis. And these were the results from that. So as you can see, they were starting to converge in the A panel, closer and closer together. So we're starting to see a little bit of that effect size kind of wash out. In that particular article with the full study write-up, we see that by the end of study, that difference between the two groups is in fact completely washed out and they've converged. At this time, however, the product had been approved. They were still required to assess the cardiovascular safety, but that trial had ended. And so what do? How do we deal with that now? You as a reviewer, how would you converse with the company? How would you negotiate some sort of understanding for cardiovascular risk with this product? Any thoughts? So here they're advocating for additional data, of course. And they have requested that the company conduct yet again another study because this one was stopped. So we have a situation where we have all these patients who have participated in a trial that was never completed. We have their data. We have an ethical responsibility to complete trials so that their efforts are not in vain, correct? How do we deal with that situation? And now we're putting additional participants at risk, the risks that are inherent with a trial for something that should have been completed before, for products that are now approved and available on the market that they can get just by asking their physician. So how would you navigate this as a company, as a regulator, and as a provider? Any thoughts? And you can put on whatever hat you want. Doesn't matter what your actual role might be.
Can you go back one to the slide with the 50% and the 25% results, the Kaplan-Meiers?
So this is actually 50% and 100. This was at the end of follow-up. And then the 25 is here. So the 25, the only place the 25 is published is in the patent application, or approval rather. As a trialist, how do you plan on recruiting for a trial that's studying a product that's already on the market? Is that even feasible? That's a great point.
Sorry, I didn't hear what was said.
Oh, I was saying that I would probably embed the trial in clinical practice and use some of EHR to facilitate data collection and just not really kind of reduce some of the burden put on health patients or healthcare workers by the trial itself. And most if patients is prescribed the drug, then it's more of a clinical routine judgment rather than a trial randomized into the testing drug.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. Not one that they've chosen to do, but yes, an excellent idea. Any other thoughts on how you might navigate this?
Well, I'm just going to say, I hope it's possible to recruit people to this comparison, because we're resubmitting a grant that does exactly this combination
Lovely.
versus placebos for obese people with asthma. And
Yeah,
what makes it novel is our outcome is asthma exacerbation. So to see if, the thinking is that, and some evidence to support that reducing obesity also reduces asthma exacerbation. And we chose this drug because it, one, is feasible to do in the context of an NIH trial, because who could afford the GLP
Mhm.
or inhibitors, is certainly not in this context. And so that gives it also more public health significance, that the combination of naltrexone and bupropion are more available to people than the newer generation. But
Absolutely.
anyway, so I hope we can recruit people.
I hope so too. I really do. And as a regulator, I think the obvious question to me at least, is what if the second trial is actually discordant with the results that we have used, we have assumed, in order to approve the drug for market use? How do we deal with that after the fact? And I think that gets back to your point about, well, do we be proactive and conduct a trial to completion in order to fully understand the safety? Or do we take a chance, see what post-marketing life does to the drug, does to the patient population, and act accordingly after? There, again, no right answer, and it's a constant struggle.
I feel like I guess the real world is not as simple as just think about it, because running a trial also takes time and money, even though patients doesn't come in and be prescribed to the testing drug. But what I was gonna say is, if we're having a drug that's embedded in a clinical trial and patients are not a lot of patients are using this drug, and that's an observation by itself. Like we know that this drug is not really actively that popular. And then if that lead to less adverse events, then that would also be fine, because people who still have the access to it, but then the population where experience the side effects is manageable, huge. I think that's also an observation maybe, but pharma company probably don't think like this, so I need to.
I think part of what you're saying may actually align with some pharma thinking, which is that the market will correct itself,
Yeah,
right? So what works will sell, what doesn't work won't sell.
right.
Whereas FDA is not going to rely on that. That's never going to be enough, right? It's just not feasible to approve a drug like that. So we have to be careful. But again, coming back to the data, if the data are all we have to work with, what do we do here? How do we make any sense of this?
But Sheriza, the FDA rarely has definitive evidence that a
Yep,
drug is really safe.
yep.
So this is kind of above and beyond what is required for many approvals.
So that comes back to the context, right? So are we applying a context that is really not relevant, not as relevant as it could be for this particular class of drug? And that's why I started with that. And I'm curious what you guys might think. These are drugs with very diverse mechanisms of action. Yes, the patient population may be the same, but there's also some differences there too. It's really hard to make these general standards. And, I sympathize with regulators because of this. It's very hard to make general standards that will apply to a large swath of drugs, quite frankly.
You have another comment?
Yeah.
Just want to say, I think in particular for this trial, I'm not sure if the intention is to select such a high risk population. Even for people with obesity, the diabetes prevalence is about 85%, the mean age is about 60. So this is really a very high risk population in the first place. So looking at these results, I guess potentially there could be some benefit in terms of reducing the risk of adverse events in this population. But if you went to markets, you probably will get a wider group of people with obesity who might want to use the drugs. And will these same results apply in that more diverse population?
Yes, you hit on a very important point. So they chose the high-risk population to get the events quickly. That was the goal. What we're seeing towards the end of that trial is exactly what you were talking about and exactly what came up in many editorials was that the patient population, because the adherence actually went down throughout the course of the trial, more mimicked the actual real-world patient population. And that's why it's hypothesized we're seeing that convergence towards the end. So it's an excellent point. So we love watching train wrecks with this group. So we're going to continue with the timeline. 2014, FDA granted that approval, right? And they had the post-marketing commitments. This is where it gets kind of funny and a little strange, but bear with me here. So 2014 and 15, remember Takeda was involved in the actual submission of that original application. They decided to take the lead on that cardiovascular clinical trial. Great. A year later, they're like, nope, we're done. They walked away. 2018, the parent company, or Exogen, then filed for bankruptcy. They were acquired by a different company, Nalpropion. A year later, they were like, nope, this isn't going to work. Currax then acquired them. 2023, so this is 1 year after they were required to actually finish the trial. Currax decided, oh, we're just going to do a real world evidence study. So they decided to try and take the shortcut. They show no increased risk for MACE. FDA was like, this is not enough. We need a trial. This is what was written into your approval. So January of this year, they screened their first participant for the Informis trial. This is now 10 years after the approval. They're starting that post-marketing requirement that they were asked to complete. Granted, it is a different company, but you inherit things, you inherit responsibilities, you inherit requirements. So this is where we are at this point. I could not find any more information about where we are in terms of the ongoing trial, but that's where we stand right now. So we shall see what the results say if it is completed, whether or not it concurs with the initial results from the light trial, albeit incomplete. Any thoughts or comments? Would you do anything differently along this pathway, especially with regards to FDA and how they handled it?
I think hearing this, and I think the question I had before, whether or not you're more cautious and require more clinical trial data than just approve it and then let the market show. From this, I would say if I were the reviewer, I would be more cautious. Personality-wise, I'm also highly risk averse.
I think we all are as epidemiologists. That's the nature of it, yeah.
So, and then given how much time it takes for a drug to be, or how much time and evidence and complicated issues, communications it takes for a drug to be taken off market. I would rather take a little more time, be cautious, and then get it on market. And
Absolutely.
then get it on, and then you take 20 years for a drug to be taken off.
Yeah, and I want to, introduce a different thought, so to speak. Let's say we do change our mind. Let's say we allow for multiple interim analyses in order to get to the point where we can actually make that decision. The 25% results, that was already out there in the open. Let's say we waited for the 50% results. That also somehow got out. At what point does the public stop having trust in the regulators, in their ability to actually make decisions, in the data that are coming out from studies, period? Do we have to be concerned about that? Do we have a responsibility as trialists to be concerned about that? And to what extent? Again, like, if you have opinions about it, please state them, but I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer with that. Yep. Shireen?
Sheriza, I think that this brings up such a good point, and to kind of, where this is today, I see this every day with accelerated approval. So I think many people are familiar with that, but that's the program where the FDA has, where we're able to approve a drug based on a reasonably likely surrogate endpoint and not actually a clinical outcome. And the sponsors make a commitment to do clinical outcomes trials after the drug has been approved. And one thing that has really come up is retention in these studies, because we have heard from patients, if you know that a drug improves some element of your disease, let's say it's tuberculosis, and it decreases the amount of tuberculosis you have in your sputum, but let's say we don't know if that necessarily leads to you dying less from tuberculosis. I think a lot of patients, might be on placebo, and they might hear from their doctors like, oh, your sputums aren't being cleared. You might, think, I must be on the placebo one. And now if the drug is commercially available, I'm gonna just ask, like you said, Sheriza, you can just ask your doctor for it once it's approved. So this is a huge challenge that we're still facing. And I think this example really highlights when there's a safety concern, but now because of accelerated approval, we're having to apply these same exact principles to notions of efficacy. So I think that this was a great example that you brought up.
And the other last, and just in case anyone was curious, I did check to see if it was approved under accelerated. It was not. It was actually regular approval, which was slightly surprising. Any other thoughts, concerns, questions, comments? Good luck when y'all get a job. Sure. Yes. You'll do great. All right. See you all next week for Journal Club.
This was great.
Take care.
You.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.